I get it, so you're not hurting my feelings. All right, so this chapter is talking about the anatomy of a plant. And I know in your heads you were like, oh, I had no idea. Yeah, but a root is a root, and a stem is a stem, and a leaf is a leaf. And we're going to just keep it pretty simple. Okay, but of course we can't keep it simple because it's biology. So we know root, stems, leaves, and of course we'll talk about flowers as we move on through this chapter. But shoot is anything above ground. Root is anything below ground, generally speaking. We will study some roots that come out of the ground, but when you say shoot, the understanding is it's above ground. When you say root, it's understood it's below ground. Do you recall what meristem is, or meristematic tissue? Stem cells. So when you see the word meristem, you know that that's a part of the plant that is doing what? Growing. It's growing. So if you see meristem, that is a part of the plant that is growing. The parts of the plant that grow, the very top, the very bottom, and the very top. And then some plants grow wide depending on how often they come back. Okay, so that's where you're going to find the stem cells. So, I just said that. We discussed basic differences between monocots and dicots in the previous section. We'll expound upon that in this one. And we'll also talk about the lifespan of plants. I need you all to be semi-excited. No? Nothing? It's okay. All right. Nothing.
This is my favorite chapter.
So far?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the first statement means?
They make their own food through light.
I truly feel like you could teach yourself this chapter, and that's okay. But plants are photosynthetic autotrophs. Truly a redundant statement. Why so?
Because we eat plants and we know what they do.
Okay, well, photosynthesis is making your own food, and autotroph is making your own food. So photosynthetic autotroph is, making their own food to make their own food. Anyway, shoot system is above ground, root system is below ground. Naturally, anything below ground is really not going to carry out photosynthesis, and that's because the sun can't get there, right? So you guys have got it. You guys have got it. I'll just sit down, we'll be done. Not really. All right. So you know that plants have a cell wall. The only organisms that we know for a fact don't have a cell wall are fantastic. All right. And in their cell wall, we have this crazy carbohydrate called cellulose. Cellulose is the carbohydrate found in the cell walls of plants. Once again, I've mentioned to you this is 100% why you cannot digest plants, why you eat them and you poop them out and they look the same, unless you chew them up really good. So like broccoli doesn't necessarily look the same, but corn does. So you eat corn and it comes out as corn. Okay? Some plants have a secondary cell wall. We have primary and second. What's the difference between primary and secondary? Primary means first, and secondary means second. So every one of them has a primary cell wall, but some of them do have a secondary cell wall, and it has cellulose, but then it also has lignin. And lignin will help create a waterproof barrier, keeping water that's inside the plant inside, and water that's outside the plant outside where that's present. Okay? We will not see that barrier on the roots. We will not see that barrier on the roots. Expiration is inevitable. So here we have just a basic plant. Shoot system above ground, root system below ground. You can see the stem and leaves. This plant has a fruit. So is it an angiosperm or a gymnosperm? Angiosperm. This plant's really good at having babies. Okay? If you had to hypothesize where the meristematic tissue was, where would that be? The tips of the roots, the tips of the leaves. Okay? Yes, that's where that plant is growing. Now, at one point, this right here was meristematic tissue, but now it's mature. So these are done growing. There's no new growth from right here. the plant continues to grow up and down, but there's no new growth here unless the plant grows out. If it's one of those plants that will stay around. Perennial, meaning come back after that, or over and over again. Okay, so plants have an indeterminate growth, which means they'll really just grow as long as as long as we provide them resources and they have space. You and I have a determinate growth, which means once we get to a certain point, although we stay alive, we don't continue growing. So plants, their growth is considered indeterminate. They grow throughout life. Their meristematic tissue is found at the ends. So literally, as long as they have the resources, so sunlight, water, and space, they will continue to grow. Okay? So it mentions that. What process allows them to increase in the number of cells? It says mitosis. It says that plants grow by increasing the number of cells. They go through mitosis. Okay? We will also see that some plant cells, especially the mature ones, become just a little bit longer. But I'll show you that when we get there. So that's what it means by increasing the size of the cell. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay?
So,
Go ahead.
oh, you said detriment growth is.
Determinate. Which,
Meaning they get to a certain point and that's when they stop.
like you and I, we get to a certain size and no matter how much food we continue to eat, we can put on weight, but we are not physically going to grow. Okay? So apical, so we already know that meristematic tissue is stem cells, and I talked to you about this in the previous chapter, the word apical. Apical means that those stem cells are located where? The tips. Apical means at the tip or the surface of. So we call it apical meristem. Mentions that it's at the root and shoot tips. This increases the height of the shoot and the length of the roots. And again, as long as they have resources, they will continue to grow. When a plant grows in this direction, we call that primary growth. Primary growth. What do you think we call it when it goes this way? Secondary. Okay, we talked about that also in the first section of this. So primary is growing up and down, secondary is getting wider. If you see, just based on what we've done in this lab, trying to make some connections real quick, you see a stem that looks like this. Would you say that this was herbaceous or woody? Herbaceous. What does that mean? As you're going through the lab, some things that I need you to be able to distinguish. Okay, so herbaceous or woody could be either dicot or monocot. It could be either. When we talk about herbaceous or woody, we're talking about the stem.
So is it whether like it has hairs on them?
They could both come with hairs, and those are really the roots that we're going to see those hairs on, unless it's a protective mechanism.
Woodies grow wide.
So, okay, one is growing wider. So you have an herbaceous stem, and you have a woody stem.
One's red wood and one's not.
One is going to have a wood stem. One is going to have a wood stem, and one is going to have a green stem. That's all that really means. Now, plants that continue to come back year after year are more than likely going to have a woody stem, versus plants that are going to cycle and die off, and then you're going to have to replant or whatever. Those tend to have herbaceous stems. Plants will have herbaceous stems first, and then develop woody stems over time if they're going to have them. Okay? Now, your question was, does it have cellulose? Is that what you were
I
saying?
was thinking you have more cellulose.
No, it does not have more cellulose. Do you remember how we talked about xylem and phloem? We're going to come back to that again. But as plants, especially trees, that are woody trees, those circles that you see when you cut the cross section and you see all the different circles, that's literally each year's xylem. And so it deposits that, and then it grows out. So it comes up through the middle, and then it deposits, it continues to grow out. And so we will actually learn, there'll be a section, I think in this section, that says, by looking at the rings, you can honestly tell how much water that plant has had resource or access to. Because if it has a whole lot of water, those rings are really big because it transports a lot of water. If it has really small rings, that means that there wasn't a lot of water. We also know that we can use those that xylem to tell what's been happening in that environment. If there's been a fire, so the tree would be, let's say, round. The side that was closest to the fire, the xylem would close, so it'll be really thin here, but really thick over here. So we would know that there was something environmentally that led to that small change. Now the next season it would be back to normal, so you could tell, you could count how long ago that was. So you can use that information to track things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have more cellulose. Good question.
That's how we know how long the tree's been there.
That is correct, by counting the number of rings, because each ring is one growing season. Okay, so perfect. So secondary growth, we already mentioned, goes this way. And in order for us to grow, we have to have meristematic tissue. So we have apical meristem here, lateral meristem here. What does lateral mean again? On the sides. Lateral means on the sides, so it's growing out sideways. Okay? It mentions that we have a self-perpetuating cylinder of tissues. Literally, it makes perfect circles. It makes perfect circles. Unless there's something environmental that stops it. Okay? Any questions right now? So monocots versus dicots, you know that cot is short for cotyledon, which means a seed leaf. Monocots have one seed leaf. Eudicots or dicots have two. Okay? So it again gives you examples, and we had similar examples in the first section of this. So it's just coming back. Here is a diagram that the book provided. The one on the last section I provided. But it distinguishes between the two again. And those of you working on the lab, this should certain things I'm looking for. Example. First of all, we know monocot has one seed leaf, two seed leaves. We talked about the multiples of the flower petals. For a monocot, it should be in 3s. For a dicot, it should be in 4s or 5s. Monocots have parallel veins on their leaves. Dicots have a branched pattern. It talks about here, and you can't really see where it's looking at the cross section of the roots, but here we have the vascular tissue organization. In a monocot, the xylem and phloem are really scattered. So when you guys bring me your monocot and dicot leaves, I'm looking at, did they really pay attention to that or not? Like those are the things that I'm looking at. In dicots, they're organized in this nice, perfect little circle. Also, fibrous roots in monocots, they kind of scatter out and they're shallow, versus a taproot found in dicots, which is one major root with small root extensions along the way. Okay, you can find lots of comparisons. This just happened to come from the textbook. But you can find lots of comparisons online with detailed diagrams. As far as the lifespan of plants, annual means that they have one growing season and then they're gone. So like your tulips, they have a growing season and then they're gone. Most people, whenever we have our first warm weekend where it's kind of nice outside, if you work at Lowe's or Home Depot or anywhere that they have a garden section, it's going to be super busy. Why? People are like, oh, it's so pretty outside, I'm going to plant flowers. The thing that drives me nuts about these people, and some of them know what they're doing, so I get it. I obviously struggle taking care of plants, but they only buy annuals. Meaning, they buy plants that at the end of the growing season are going to die and not come back. So guess what they're going to have to do again next year? They're going to have to buy more plants. And then they're going to have to plant them. And then they're going to complain that their back hurts that week at work because they've been bent over planting plants. I don't get it. I don't get it, but it's what happens every year. Every year. And how many of your parents go out and buy plants on those nice weekends? Yes. Not me. Not me. I stick with my fake ones because I can make sure they stay alive. Or not, at least look alive. Biannual means that they have 2 growing seasons. A biannual plant will only grow green the first season, and it won't flower until the second season. It'll grow green the first season, but it won't flower until the second season. But after that second season, it's out too. Okay? These are my favorites, perennials, because they always come back. So it's one plant, and you're done. Okay? These are mostly, of course, your big trees are perennials, but your bushes and your shrubs, sometimes we can take things that are supposed to be trees, and I've noticed a lot of people in Texas kind of prune them back and kind of make them look a little bit more flowery than they need to be, just because in the long run, it's a lot less work, and that plant's going to continue to come back. So annual has 1 growing season. It mentions that these are only herbaceous. What does that mean again? It's only going to say green. The stem will only be green. It will never have a woody stem. Okay? Biennial has 2 growing seasons, and perennials come back every year. Perennials come back every year. Questions on this? Okay. Now, plant tissues. You and I have already discussed vascular tissues, xylem and phloem. And of course, we're going to come back to those again today. But there are 3 types of tissues in plants. Vascular, which you already know. Then there's ground. And then there's dermal. Vascular, ground, and dermal. Just using common sense, what do you think dermal tissue is? Outer layer. Yes. It's like the epidermis, dermis. It's like the skin, the outside. So we know that vascular tissue is veins and arteries. So there's xylem and phloem. We know dermal tissue is like the skin. So what do you think ground tissue is? It's everything else. Everything that's not vascular or dermal is ground. Everything that's not vascular or dermal is ground. Okay, now, this diagram breaks it down, ground, vascular, and dermal, and then it tells you the tissue that falls into that classification. So again, vascular, you already know. Dermal is going to be dermis and epidermis, which is just like us, so that's a good parallel. But ground tissue, we have parenchymal cells, collenchymal, and sclerenchymal. Yeah?
I don't know.
Not passionate about it.
Why don't we just call it collenchyma
Collenchyma. Collenchyma.
or parenchyma?
And you know what? Caleb, you call it whatever you want. Do whatever you want. Okay, you can do that. The best part about this chart is it puts all the tissue types on one slide, because we're about to divide them up into individual slides. But I would reference this slide for the tissue types. Okay? Collenchymal. Collenchymal.
Collenchyma is kind of fun to say though.
It is. Or you can look at your plants outside while you're talking to your parents. This is very rigid sclerenchymal tissue.
Never gonna say
Never?
If I ever said something like that to my parents, they might laugh at me. Yeah, I don't know.
My dad would engage. He loves plants. Well, you are so right, big doll. Dad, stop. I call my dad a tree sniffer because everywhere we go, he'll like walk up to a tree and he'll kind of rub on it and be like, "This is a pecan."
What?
You are a... We're in public. Stop. He'll be like, no, look at these leaves. Look at these. He'll pick up pecans everywhere we're at. I'm like, don't be that guy.
You don't sniff it, just look at the pecans on the ground and say it's a pecan tree.
Sometimes he'll like hold the leaf like it's like this delicate. When I needed stems for this lab, I called my dad a week in advance. Dad, I need some clippings from your trees because he has all these different trees. Yes, all right, baby doll. I will cut them, I will prune them, and I will label them. Because they probably, your students probably don't, that's why they're labeled. That's my dad. He was like, I want you to have every type, and yes, and he was like, I'm going to put some bud tissue on there so that they can see. Yeah, but he's a tree sniffer. If you see him in the park, the guy still on the tree, that's my dad. Hey, are you Jessica's dad? Oh, I sure am. All right, anyways. Okay.
I was looking at this tree.
I was just admiring the beauty of nature. Dad, why are you so awkward? Anyways, all right, so here we have a cross section. So we've taken this stem and we've cut it this way. We call that a transverse cut. On the very outside, you have dermal tissue, which makes sense. Okay? In the middle, we have our xylem and phloem, our vessels. So that means everything else is ground tissue. And we have it broken up. You can see that the parenchymal cells are most exterior. Then we have parenchymal cells. And then the sclerenchyma are most interior. Okay, and you can kind of see that division. When you look at this at first, you're like, oh, whatever, I don't really care. I get it. But you can also see the difference kind of in the size and the organization of those cells. It is safe to say that parenchymal cells, they're going to be used for, all of these are going to be used for support. But like that part of the apple that you eat, I know it's an ovary, but the white crunchy part in the middle, that's actually parenchymal cells. Like all of that is parenchymal cells. And this, it seems like there's not a lot right here because we're looking at a stem. A fruit is much bigger and has a lot more parenchymal cells, a lot more ground tissue. Okay? Now, parenchymal cells. So this slide is just on parenchyma. It is a soft primary tissue. All right? It mentions that it's primary cell walls. So it only has one, no secondary cell walls. They're pliable and permeable. What do those words mean?
You can bend.
Yeah, they're bendable, flexible, and if they're permeable, that means stuff can pass through it. Yes. Okay? These cells are specialized for storage, because we're going to store a lot of glucose, which is why you like to eat them, secretion, and photosynthesis. So you can see we have a bunch of parenchymal cells here, or parenchyma, or parenchyma, if Caleb's saying it. Parenchyma. All right, now we have parenchymal cells, or parenchyma, or collenchyma, if you can. These are still flexible, but their primary cell wall, that's all they have anyway, they don't have a secondary one, is much thicker. Okay, much thicker. It also mentions that those cells kind of become elongated. So they start to stretch out. And I showed you in that previous picture, they were a little bit bigger. Okay? And that's a good way to help identify what cells you're looking at. Not that you are ever going to look at a cross-section of a stem and say, oh, I wonder how many of these are parenchymal cells. And if you do, that's healthy.
So the cells that look like they're stretched are the
Most of the time, but sometimes they don't have to necessarily be stretched. They just kind of look
like wider.
Sclerenchymal cells. These cells have a thick secondary cell wall. So of course they're going to be used for protection support. Okay? It mentions that we have sclerids, which is why we call it sclerenchyma, and other fibers that help to support these cells. Sclerenchymal cells. So collenchyma and parenchyma only have primary cell walls. Sclerenchyma has primary and secondary. That's correct. Yes, sir, I did. Okay, now to vascular tissue. So what we just did was ground, parenchyma, and parenchyma. Now we have vascular tissue. This right here is just talking about xylem. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because we call it xylem, but there are smaller parts of that vessel. So xylem is made up of tracheids and vessel elements. So if you see tracheids or vessel elements, I need you to recognize that that's specifically talking about xylem. And xylem is responsible for transporting what? Water. In which direction? Up. Very good. Okay. It mentions, just pointing out a couple things to reinforce content, that the xylem has thick, lignified secondary walls. What does lignified mean? It has lignin, which is a waterproofing protein. Would it make sense that vessels that were supposed to transport water will be waterproof? Yes. Yes, it would. Do what? Get out. That is exactly correct. So that water does not get out. Okay? So, these are the vessels themselves, but these are the cells that make them up, tracheids and vessel members. Or you might also see this called vessel elements. Okay, but that all is xylem. Okay, so xylem up close. Look at that. Okay, yeah. You have yourself good all together. This is responsible for transporting water. Tracheids. This second type of vascular tissue is phloem. And phloem is responsible for transporting food in which direction? Down. Then, of course, we can't just know it as phloem. The cells that can accompany it are called sieve tube or sieve tube members. So you'll see both. And then companion cells. So sieve tube members and companion cells make up phloem. Tracheids and vessel elements make up xylem. Okay. I don't know why it just can't be simple. I'm telling you. Yes. They just like to sound smarter than you. Okay, so we've done ground tissue, vascular tissue. This is showing you sieve tube members. So this is phloem. So if you see companion cells, you know you're dealing with phloem. If you see tracheids, you know you're dealing with xylem. Very well. Okay, the last type of tissue is dermal tissue. Dermal tissue, of course, has a waxy cuticle. Okay, we have already talked about the stomata, but this word was also used as stoma with no ata on it. Okay, so stoma and stomata, same thing. Don't get confused, please and thank you. Stoma and stomata, same thing. Do you remember that these were the pores at the bottoms of the leaves? If you've done your lab, it's talked about it. Okay, the goal is that what we do in lecture is reinforced by lab. Every pore or opening is protected by guard cells, and those are the ones that will open and close. In Texas, during the days, ours stay closed. Enjoy it. Yes. Unless you have an inside plant. Some of your parents grow the plants inside, and those plants do not close during the day because they're not afraid of the heat, because there's no real heat in your house that they're protected. Okay? It mentions here we have some specialized accessories to the epidermis of plants. One of them is trichomes. If you have ever played outside in your life, in a field, And you know how there's those weeds that when you touch them, you get like this stickiness to you? Literally, if you look at them underneath the dissecting microscope, the stem has these little sticky, pokey things. Those sticky, pokey things are called trichomes. And when you touch them, they secrete a toxin. So some of you, when you go play in those grass fields and you pick up or you touch a weed with that and you get that stickiness, some of you start itching shortly after because it becomes an irritant to your skin. Some of you, it has no effect at all. But that's the plant's way of saying, stay away from it. And if you have a yard where your weeds grow to be like 6 feet tall because it's never mowed, or you know of a yard, when you look at those weeds up close, because the stems are really thick, you can see the trichomes very visibly. And so you go to grab them or touch them, and it's just sticky toxin that it's putting on you, so you stay away from it. Okay, now root hairs are nothing more, and if you've done your lab and you've looked at the roots of the radish under the dissecting microscope, you can actually see the little hairs. And those are just increasing surface area. The increase in surface area allows for that root to absorb more water. Okay, so root hairs are used for more absorption. Okay, so some epidermal tissue up close. This is where we stop for today. Yes. We'll do shoots and roots. Yes. We're on a Valentine's schedule.